In the final, burning months of World War II, the Pacific was a graveyard of ships and planes. Japan was cornered, its cities reduced to rubble by wave after wave of American B-29 bombers. Every night, firestorms lit the sky over Tokyo, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Yet still, the empire fought on. From their bases on the Mariana Islands, the giant silver bombers of the United States Army Air Forces flew thousand-mile missions deep into Japanese airspace. Those flights were long, dangerous, and lonely. The bombers could carry tons of incendiaries, but they were vulnerable. Without fighter protection, they were easy targets for Japanese interceptors. The answer came in early 1945, when one small, hellish island was taken at staggering cost. Its name was Iwo Jima. That 8-square-mile patch of volcanic rock was the key. From it, American fighters could finally reach Japan, escort the B-29s all the way to their targets, and rescue crippled bombers returning from raids. It became the lifeline between the bombers and home. The men who flew from that island were part of a new kind of mission called Very Long Range Escort, VLR. Their job, to take the legendary P-51 Mustang, a single-engine fighter designed for Europe, and push it far beyond what anyone thought it could do. The Mustang was a pilot's dream, sleek, fast, graceful. With drop tanks, it could fly over 2,000 miles. But over the vast Pacific, even that range was tested to the limit. Every flight meant hours of nothing but water. No land to aim for if the engine quit. No safe place to ditch. Just blue emptiness below and faith in a roaring Merlin engine up front. The pilots stationed on Iwo Jima lived with that knowledge every day. They slept in tents half buried in volcanic ash, the smell of sulfur and fuel in the air. Each morning they cleaned the black grit from their guns and instruments. And when the order came, they strapped in, took off, and trusted the machine to bring them back. By late May 1945, the island had settled into a rhythm of heat, noise, and exhaustion. The war seemed nearly over, yet for the Mustang pilots, every mission still carried the same deadly risk. Engines failed, fuel calculations went wrong, weather turned savage without warning. The Pacific did not forgive mistakes. On the night of May 31 SD, word spread through the 15th, 21st, and 506 fighter groups. A new mission was planned for dawn. Target: Osaka**, one of Japan's largest industrial cities. The B-29s would go in heavy. The fighters would escort them across the final stretch of ocean, protect them from enemy interceptors, and guide any damaged bombers home. It was officially known as Mission Number 82. To the men who signed the flight sheets, it looked routine. They had done it before. Long hours, short combat, then the long flight back to that strip of black sand. But this time would be different. Dawn broke over Iwo Jima at 0400 hours. The island was silent except for the wind off Mount Suribachi. Then, slowly, the camp came alive. Pilots pulled on flight suits still stiff with salt. Mechanics checked engines one last time. The smell of coffee and aviation fuel mixed in the morning air. Inside the briefing hut, the men gathered around a map pinned to a board. The mission commander pointed to the long arc drawn across the Pacific toward Japan. He talked through headings, radio frequencies, fuel loads, and rendezvous points. Then came the weather report, short, routine, almost casual. Scattered clouds. Possible frontal activity halfway to target. Nothing unusual. To a man, the pilots nodded. The Pacific always had weather. They'd flown through clouds before, through rain and wind. Nothing in the officer's tone suggested danger. But that small line on the map, the thin curve marked, frontal zone, would soon become the death trap that swallowed 24 men. At 6 o'clock sharp, engines began to roar to life. The little island shook. Under the thunder of nearly 150 P-51s starting up together. Crew chiefs gave thumbs up, and flight leaders taxied to the runway. The first to roll was Lieutenant Colonel Harvey J. Scandrett, commander of the 45th Fighter Squadron. His Mustang bore the name Madam Whamdam. He was experienced, respected, and confident. Close behind him were men like Captain Stuart Lumpkin, Lieutenant Ed L'Infante, and the youngest, Second Lieutenant Arthur A. Bury, barely 20 years old, flying his very first long-range mission. By 0630, the last pair of Mustangs lifted off. The island shrank behind them, a dark scar in the blue ocean. The sun was rising straight ahead, toward Japan. The first hour passed peacefully. The formation climbed steadily to cruising altitude, 25,000 feet. They switched to long-range tanks and trimmed their planes for endurance. Conversation over the radio was light, simple call and response, navigation checks, jokes about breakfast back at base. Below them stretched nothing but the Pacific, endless, flat, hypnotic. After a while, even that beauty turned strange. Pilots stared down at the water, trying not to think about what would happen if the engine coughed once, just once. There was no margin for error. They called it the longest swim in the world. After about 2 hours, the first signs of weather appeared on the horizon. At first it was just a haze. Then a gray line. Then, as they closed the distance, a wall, tall, dark, and rising higher every minute. The weather front. It looked far larger than anything the forecast had suggested. The lead formation tried climbing above it. At 30,000 feet, the tops of the clouds still towered ahead. They could not go around. They would burn too much fuel. And turning back meant aborting the mission, something no commander wanted to do without orders. They sent out a coded warning to the groups behind. The oranges are sour. It meant the weather was bad, very bad, but not yet impassable. The hope was that command might reconsider. But the order from Iwo Jima came back quickly, proceed as planned. So they pressed on. Within minutes the bright morning sky vanished into gray. The first layers were thin, wispy. Then came heavy cloud, dense and churning. Lightning flashed inside it. The air shook. What none of them knew was that this was not an ordinary storm. It was a massive Pacific weather front, a spinning wall of thunderheads 50,000 feet high. Inside it, winds tore in opposite directions, creating violent updrafts and downdrafts. The temperature dropped. Moisture froze on wings in seconds. The moment the first group entered, the world turned black. Lieutenant L'Infante would later remember, It was like flying into a wall. The cockpit went dark. The instruments started spinning. You couldn't tell up from down. One by one, Mustangs lost formation. Pilots tried to hold position by instrument, but their gyros tumbled and failed. Airspeed indicators froze. Rain and hail hammered the planes so hard that paint peeled off the leading edges of wings. Over the radio came bursts of panic, voices shouting headings, altitude, cries for help. Then silence. The storm swallowed the sound. In the chaos, several pilots were thrown into uncontrolled dives. Some broke through the bottom of the storm and skimmed the ocean surface before pulling up. Others never made it. One wingman glimpsed a flash, a Mustang spinning, its tail torn off, then nothing. Near the center of the storm, Lieutenant Colonel Scandrett's flight disappeared from radar. His last transmission was calm, routine, and then it stopped. He and his plane, Madame Whamdam, were never seen again. Behind him, others fought desperately to survive. Lieutenant Bury, on his first long mission, later recalled seeing lightning streak across his wings, the electrical charge crawling along the canopy like white fire. He closed his eyes and prayed. When he opened them again, he was falling, his altimeter spinning down. He pulled the stick with both hands, feeling the Mustang shake and groan. Somehow, the plane leveled out. But when he looked around, he was alone. The formation was gone. For those who broke free on the far side, the scene was unreal. The sun burst out again, the ocean glowed beneath them, but the sky was empty. Formations that had taken off together were now scattered over hundreds of miles. Some pilots were already low on fuel from the struggle inside the storm. Others were missing entirely. And the weather behind them was closing fast, cutting off the route home. Yet the mission had to go on. They pressed toward Japan, each small group now flying on its own, hoping to find the bombers they were meant to escort. By then, the scale of the disaster was impossible to see. Radios were jammed, communication broken. On Iwo Jima, controllers waited for position reports that never came. Those who made it through would later say they had never seen anything like it. The Pacific had always been dangerous, but this was different, alive, almost conscious in its fury. One pilot said, asterisk, "You could feel the air biting at the plane. It wanted to tear you apart." Asterisk. At that moment, no one thought about glory, or medals, or victory. The only thought left was survival. Get through the storm, find clear air, and pray the engine kept running. The men who left Iwo Jima that morning thought they were heading to war. Instead, they had flown straight into nature's ambush. By the end of that day, the sky itself would claim more American pilots than any enemy fighter ever had. By mid-morning, the mission to Osaka was already falling apart. The storm that had swallowed the Mustangs was now a living monster stretching from horizon to horizon. From the ground, it looked like an endless mountain of cloud, twisting and rolling in the distance. Inside it, men were fighting not an enemy, but the sky itself. As the first scattered groups broke out of the storm, they found themselves alone. Formations that had been tight and disciplined were now reduced to isolated pairs or single aircraft, hundreds of miles apart. Radio channels were filled with static. The Pacific stretched below, calm and indifferent. The first realization set in: no one knew exactly where they were. Navigating over open water was already difficult in good weather. Now, after being thrown around for half an hour inside a storm, every pilot's compass was unreliable, every position guess uncertain. Some believed they were near the Japanese coast. Others thought they were still far out to sea. And some were flying on instruments that no longer worked at all. One pilot later said, asterisk, "It was like waking up in another world. You came out of the clouds and realized you were completely alone. No formation. No leader. No idea which way home was." Asterisk. Farther back, the groups that had hesitated at the edge of the storm were still trying to decide whether to continue. Some attempted to skirt around the front, climbing higher or turning east. But each time, the wall of cloud rose ahead of them, taller, darker, boiling upward like smoke from a volcano. There was no safe path through. Still, they pressed on. Turning back meant disobeying orders. And on Iwo Jima, the commanders expected the mission to proceed. There was no knowledge yet of what was happening in the clouds. As more Mustangs entered the storm, the disaster multiplied. Pilots reported lightning dancing across their wings, control surfaces freezing, instruments spinning wildly. Some described seeing blue flames crawling across the propeller blades, a phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, caused by static electricity in the storm. Others never had time to describe anything. Lieutenant Edlin Fonte later recalled one of the moments that stayed with him for life. "I saw a Mustang ahead of me start to climb. The pilot was fighting to hold it down, but the updrafts just grabbed him. The next thing I saw was his plane going vertical, then rolling over. It disappeared into the cloud. I never saw him again." Some pilots tried to dive under the storm, hoping to find clearer air near the ocean. But at low altitude, the rain was so heavy that visibility dropped to almost nothing. The surface of the sea was a sheet of white foam. One pilot barely pulled up in time to avoid slamming into the waves. Another didn't. Within the space of half an hour, dozens of aircraft were missing. Out of the original 148, at least 27 would never return. Most were not shot down. They simply vanished into the weather, their engines silenced somewhere over the Pacific. On Iwo Jima, as the hours passed, ground crews gathered by the radio room, waiting for news. The radar screens showed faint traces of aircraft returning from the north, but the numbers didn't add up. The expected formations were smaller, broken, incomplete. There were no enemy reports, no air combat messages. Only silence. By noon, it was clear something had gone terribly wrong. Meanwhile, over the sea, the pilots who had survived the storm now faced another problem: fuel. The violent turbulence inside the clouds had burned through their long-range tanks faster than expected. Some had been forced to switch to main fuel hours early just to stay level. That meant they had little chance of making it all the way home. Lieutenant Arthur Bury checked his gauges and knew he was running out. The storm was behind him, Japan somewhere ahead, and Iwo Jima too far to reach on what he had left. He turned south, hoping to find clear air and a course toward home. After another hour of flying alone, the needle hit empty. When his engine sputtered and died, he was 5,000 feet above the Pacific. He radioed his position, though by now, even he wasn't sure where that was, then unbuckled his harness and pulled the canopy handle. The slipstream ripped it away. The roar of the engine faded, replaced by the howling wind. He bailed out. The parachute opened with a jerk, and then there was only silence. He drifted downward for what felt like forever, watching the small black dot of his Mustang hit the sea and vanish. When he splashed down, the water was shockingly cold. Waves rose and fell around him, endless blue stretching in every direction. He inflated his yellow life raft, climbed in, and waited. The sun burned overhead. The horizon stayed empty. Back in the air, small groups of Mustangs were reforming wherever they could find each other. Captain Stuart Lumpkin and his flight managed to regroup 3 planes together. They had all come through the storm battered but alive. But they were still deep over enemy territory. The bombers they were supposed to escort were gone. The sky was empty. They turned toward home, carefully calculating fuel. Some threw out their drop tanks to reduce drag. Every minute mattered. Lumpkin later said, "We didn't even talk on the radio anymore. Everyone just listened for the sound of the engine, praying it kept running." The flight crossed the coast of Japan and saw the ocean again, a sight that meant life. But they were still hundreds of miles from Iwo Jima. Clouds of vapor trailed from the wings. Fuel gauges hovered near zero. One by one, their engines began to cough. Far below, Lieutenant Bury floated in his raft. The day passed into night. No ships, no planes. He rationed his emergency chocolate bar and sipped from his canteen. Each time he looked at the horizon, he expected to see rescue, but saw nothing. He would drift for days before being found. On the second day, he spotted a faint shape in the distance, a gray submarine surfacing silently through the swells. It was the USS Truda, patrolling the area on rescue duty. The crew spotted the tiny yellow raft and moved in. When they pulled Bury aboard, his face was burned and his voice hoarse, but he was alive. He was one of the lucky ones. Others were not so fortunate. By the evening of June 1st, reports were filtering back to Iwo Jima. Planes overdue. No contact. Several had been sighted ditching at sea. Search aircraft were sent out, but the weather still churned across the Pacific, making visibility almost impossible. When the surviving Mustangs finally began to return, the airfield fell silent. Mechanics stood by the runway, counting them as they landed. One group came in with 6 planes instead of 12. Another had only 3. Many returned alone, landing with empty tanks, some with their canopies gone or antennas snapped off by hail. One pilot stepped down from his Mustang and vomited on the tarmac. He hadn't eaten since dawn. Another just sat on his wing and stared at the horizon. No one spoke for a long time. When the final tally was made, the numbers stunned everyone. 27 Mustangs lost. 24 pilots missing or confirmed dead. No enemy aircraft had been encountered that day. Not a single shot fired in anger. All the losses were to the weather. It was a kind of defeat the military was not used to understanding. There was no visible enemy, no heroism in combat, no dogfight to write about in the papers. Just men gone, swallowed by a storm. The survivors were debriefed that night. They described the weather as something alive, something intelligent. They said the clouds twisted around them like smoke, lightning bursting inside. Some planes, they said, simply flipped over and fell. Others vanished into blackness and were never seen again. The base chaplain held a small service. The next morning, no bodies, no coffins, just empty helmets lined up on a table. The men stood in silence as the chaplain read the names. When he finished, the wind swept across the runway, carrying the volcanic dust into the air. It clung to their boots, their faces, their aircraft. For a long moment, no one moved. In the days that followed, the wreckage of some Mustangs was found floating far out at sea. Others were never located. The Pacific kept its secrets. The families back home received telegrams that said only, "Missing in action, presumed lost." Among them was the family of Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Scandrett. His Mustang, Madame Wham-Dam, had vanished completely. To this day, no trace of the plane or its pilot has ever been recovered. For those who survived, the memory of that day stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it only rarely, and when they did, their voices always lowered. Because the enemy on June 1, 1945, was not Japan. It was the weather. The men who faced it learned that even in the age of machines and metal, nature still ruled the sky. The Pacific had taken them without a sound, without warning, without mercy. And for those who returned, every engine rumble, every flicker of lightning, would forever remind them of the day the storm became the killer. The morning after the storm broke calm and deceptively bright. On Iwo Jima the air was clear, the volcano's black sand gleaming in the sun, the sea flat as glass. To anyone arriving that day, it might have looked like a perfect Pacific morning. But for the men of the 506th Fighter Group, it was the quietest morning they had ever known. The ramp was nearly empty. Where rows of gleaming Mustangs had stood the day before, now there were gaps, spaces marked only by oil stains and the names painted on boards above them. Some ground crewmen still kept the engines warm for planes that would never return. Others just stared at the open sky, waiting for the impossible shape of AP-51 to appear on the horizon. Messages from the search aircraft began to arrive through the radio static. A raft spotted here, a wing floating there. No survivors confirmed yet. By noon the list of missing names had been posted outside operations. 24 pilots. Most of them friends, tent mates, men who had eaten breakfast together less than 24 hours earlier. That evening, the survivors gathered in the mess hall. There were no speeches, no music. A single officer read the roll call, his voice cracking when he reached the end. For every name with no answer, someone struck the table once with a fist. The sound echoed like gunfire in the still air. Afterward, the men drifted outside. Some went to the edge of the airfield, where the wind carried the smell of the ocean. They watched the sunset turn the clouds red, the same color as the storm that had taken their friends. No one said the word fear, but it hung there between them, heavy and unspoken. They had learned something the manuals never taught, that bravery was not always enough. In the days that followed, the rescue effort widened. B-17, Dumbo, search planes combed the ocean in grids, sometimes guided by faint emergency beacons. Submarines cruised slowly, scanning for yellow life rafts. A few were found, sun-bleached, empty, drifting like forgotten leaves on a vast blue sea. Each one was marked, photographed, and left to the current. A handful of survivors were picked up, gaunt and sunburned but alive. Lieutenant Burry among them. When he was flown back to Iwo Jima, he walked straight from the transport plane to the operations office and asked for the roster. He scanned the names until he realized most of the men he'd flown with were gone. He didn't speak. He just folded the list, slipped it into his pocket, and carried it for the rest of his life. Officially, the mission report listed the cause as extreme meteorological conditions. Unofficially, the pilots called it what it was, Black Friday. It wasn't the first time weather had killed, but it was the worst single-day loss of fighters in the Pacific without enemy action. Commanders on Guam and Iwo Jima launched an immediate investigation. How had a front so violent gone unnoticed? Why had so many flights been ordered through it? Meteorologists pieced together that the storm had been born from two colliding systems, one tropical, one Arctic, meeting directly over the route to Japan. It had risen faster than forecasts could track. No radar network existed then to warn the pilots. The only instruments they had were eyes, instincts, and a compass spinning in circles. In the aftermath, new procedures were written almost overnight. Weather flights were increased. Detailed forecasting became mandatory before every long-range escort. For the first time, commanders realized that nature itself could be as deadly an enemy as any gun. Yet for the men on Iwo Jima, regulations were no comfort. They had to fly again within days. Missions resumed. Engines roared, propellers turned, and the next wave of Mustangs took off toward Japan. Each pilot who climbed into his cockpit that week knew the risks better than anyone alive. But none refused. They carried the weight of those who hadn't returned. One pilot later wrote in his diary, "We flew through the same clouds, but we looked at them differently. Every bit of turbulence, every flash of lightning, we saw ghosts in it." Back home, telegrams arrived one by one. They began with the same sentence every family dreaded. "The War Department regrets to inform you." Some mothers held on to hope for months, imagining their sons still adrift somewhere in the Pacific. For most, closure never came. The ocean had no grave markers. In Wisconsin, Harvey Scandrett's parents kept his room untouched. His flight jacket hung by the bed, still smelling faintly of fuel and salt. When the newsreels finally mentioned the mission, it was only a line, asterisk. "Heavy losses due to adverse weather." Asterisk. No names, no faces. History moved on. But among the surviving pilots, the memory became a legend, a quiet one, told only among those who had flown that day. They said the storm had a voice. They said you could hear it in the wind whenever thunder rolled over Iwo Jima's volcano. Years later, when the war ended and the men returned home, the story of Black Friday began to fade. Some tried to tell it, but few wanted to listen. The world preferred tales of dogfights and victory. Weather did not fit easily into glory. Still, in the old reunions of the 506th, they always raised a glass for the 24. Each name spoken aloud once a year. Each face remembered. Decades passed. The airfield at Iwo Jima fell silent, overtaken by grass and wind. The control tower crumbled. But the records remained, mission logs, call signs, radio transcripts filled with static. And in the archives of the U.S. Air Force, a simple entry stands under June 1, 1945. Escort mission. Severe weather. 27 aircraft lost. Cause natural forces. Today, historians call it one of the most tragic non-combat air disasters of World War II. But for those who know the story, it's more than a statistic. It's a reminder that courage has limits, that even the most advanced machines of their time could be humbled by the raw power of the earth and sky. If you stand on Iwo Jima's black sand today, you can still feel the wind rising off the Pacific. It carries the same smell of salt, the same hum in the air before a storm. Some say that when lightning flashes far out over the water, it looks like wings, silver for a heartbeat then gone. The men of Black Friday are out there somewhere, beneath those endless waves. No monuments mark their names. But in every pilot who checks the weather before takeoff, in every mission delayed for safety, a piece of their story still lives. Because the lesson they left was written not in victory, but in loss. That courage is not only in fighting the enemy. Sometimes it is in facing the storm, knowing it may not let you come home.